Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you all of you. Good morning. Thank you for being part of this program. It's a privilege to help welcome this historic conference on farm worker health research. It's also very appropriate to host this, even if only virtually, here in California's Central Valley, often referred to as the breadbasket of the world. I'm also pleased to welcome California Senator Ana Caballero, who spent so much of her career in the public sector fighting for the land and people of California and their continued health and success, and has been such a good friend of the university. I'm also very pleased that we will be joined for closing remarks by Assemblyman Robert Rivas, who Ana mentioned just a minute ago, who also grew up as a farm worker in farm worker housing and has become such a legislative champion of the people who work in agriculture here. And just as a personal aside, many are aware that my father, like others who, when they first came to this country, came here with his brother Encarnacion, they called them Chon, and worked here in Delano, around that area, in Pisqueando la Uva, working a grape. And he talked to me and all of us about his time working and the difficulty of that kind of labor. I hope many of you are aware of UC's growing national reputation. Those that work at the institution certainly are. The first public research university of the 21st century, helping redefine what it means, inclusive excellence, access for the 21st century. To be the youngest R2 Carnegie Research Institution, recognized only in our 15th year of operation. Entered the U.S. News World Report rankings as a top 100 public and private university out of 4,500 nationally. Think about that in just over a decade. Extraordinary. And that is the caliber of the faculty and the staff and the students that are part of this magnificent institution. The mission of UC is not only to educate the young people of the Central Valley, but to help them improve the social capital of their families, their communities, so many of which are engaged in agriculture. And so we cannot be successful divorced from the interest and the contributions of agriculture and those who work the land. A great deal of the research and education at UC Merced is focused, as some of you might know, directly or indirectly on farms and farming and farm workers, from engineering that are creating new drone and sensor technology for precision to precision water and the pesticide delivery system in a way that isn't as harmful as it has been in the past, as well as the disparities of health among rural communities and the people of color. The majority of the frontline agricultural workers. If anything, the pandemic has re-exposed the disparities and inequities in the healthcare of these frontline agricultural workers. We have to do more to support them, their family, not just as they labor, but once they exit the field, later stages of their life. How do we care for them with dignity? Our BS, many of you might be aware of our Biosafety Lab 3, which will soon begin work on valley fever, a long-time affliction of California farm workers. My office approved $1 million in equipment funding for the BSL lab to begin its work, specifically in the area of valley fever and others. And we have started preliminary planning for the first ever campus smart farm, where faculty and students will work side by side, testing their ideas to improve this critical sector. And my office, the Chancellor's office, provided the initial funding for this enterprise. Our accelerated drive to medical education is very relevant to the discussions today. UC, with our partnership with UC San Francisco in Fresno, UC Merced will begin in 2 years enrolling the BS to the MD. Just think about that. Students from the San Joaquin Valley can attend the University of California, Merced to achieve their Bachelor's of Science and continue through a medical degree in partnership with UC San Francisco in Fresno. We will build this expertise in rural public health, serving one of California's most medically underserved regions and population. This is what a University of California Merced can do for the region in partnership with all of our colleagues, both in Fresno, Bakersfield, Stanislaus State, etc. And we are so proud of UC Merced, which this spring celebrated the naming of our first Rhodes Scholar, a young graduate student who came here to do cutting edge work in water management and is now a Rhodes Scholar, which is, of course, globally recognized as a marker of excellence. Of course, the center, at the center of much of our work is to improve the lives of agricultural workers in our community and our Community and Labor Center, which is co-hosting today's conference with colleagues from UC Berkeley, UC Agriculture and Natural Resources, and the California Rural Legal Assistance. And I'm eager to learn more about the proceedings of this conference, which will address such a broad set of topics that are so critical to this region, our country, and indeed, I might say, the world. The general rubric of farm worker health and access to care is not only important to the University of California's mission of teaching, research, and service, it's critical to the Central Valley, which we are located in and which we are serving. And as you heard me mention earlier, my father arrived and labored in himself in the 1950s when he came from, León, he's from León, Guanajuato, but he came from the DF, the Capirucha, or people refer to it as the capital. He told me as a young boy, you can make a living with your hands, okay, or your head. What we want to do is create a community that does both, okay, that honors the labor of those that toil in the fields and understand how they provide the nourishment for all the other endeavors that we are a part of. There is always dignity in labor and effort, and we cannot afford to forget that or separate it from the mission of the University of California. So we are proud to do this work, to do the work that we do at UC Merced. And I'm sure you are all proud as researchers of the benefits of your work and what it has produced and will produce for those who feed our country and the world. I thank you again for this opportunity to welcome, to offer a few remarks for the conference. I wish you a day of inspiration filled with magnificent ideas and significant success. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Muñoz, for those uplifting words. Thank you. Right now, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, State Senator representing District 12, Ana Caballero. Senator Caballero has had a long and distinguished career in public service. She received her BA from UC San Diego and JD from UCLA School of Law before working as an attorney for the California Rural Legal Assistance and represent striking farm workers and to prevent plant closures. She served on the Salinas City Planning Commission, the Salinas City Council, and then as mayor of Salinas. In 2006, Caballero was elected to represent State Assembly District 28 and then State Assembly District 30 before running successfully for the State Senate District 12, which he now represents since 2018. As I mentioned earlier, Senator Caballero championed the state's appropriation for our study, which is supporting this conference. I'll turn it over to her to deliver a keynote speech. Hope she's not in the participants. Okay, we are, let us figure out if she's not in the participants. Thank you for your patience. Okay, Crystal, can you please send Marisa the link so she can get on, please, as a panelist?
Yeah, Anna, just one moment. I just was talking with her scheduler, so I'm going to resend it right now just so that she can jump on. Sorry.
Right, no problem.
Watching, but I'm not able to.
We hear you, Senator.
Here I am.
Yes, apologies for that.
Isn't technology wonderful when it works, and then when it doesn't, who knows? Well, let me just start by saying thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you today. Thank you to the UC Merced Community and Labor Center, California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, UC Berkeley, and UCANR. I'm really honored to be able to join you. And thank you for your patience. For some reason, I ended up on, but not as a participant. As you heard, I'm Senator Ana Caballero, and I represent the Salinas Valley and the counties of Merced and San Benito and parts of Stanislaus, Madera, and Fresno County. So as you can see, a big, large agricultural district, and farm worker issues are close to my heart. I started my career as a lawyer for CRLA, and since then have remained committed to doing everything I can to improve the lives of farm workers and their families here in the state. 2 years ago, I, along with Assembly Member Robert Rivas, who will be speaking later today, strongly advocated and pushed the legislature and the governor to fund the farm worker health study that's being conducted at UC Merced. And I'm really pleased and proud of the work that they are doing. This follows up on a study that was done 20 years ago of farm worker health. And it's critical for us to have really good data and information on the status of farm workers and their family so that we can do everything possible to improve whether it's healthcare or pesticides or working conditions. We want to make sure we're getting good data to help us to do that. This pandemic that we've been suffering through for the past year plus is really a good example of why this study, I mean, it couldn't have come at a more appropriate time to have a study because this pandemic has been tremendously devastating to the farm worker community and their families. What we know is the data shows very clearly that the essential worker population, the farm worker population, has overwhelmingly borne the brunt of the pandemic, both in deaths and in contracting the virus. And the challenge is that although we have the vaccine right now, we just don't know what the long-term effects of this COVID virus is going to have on the community, especially since new variants are popping up. And the research and commitment to farm worker health and well-being will be important to help policymakers try to craft solutions as we move forward. And to say nothing of the mental health issues that have been are a result of this virus. Many farm workers feel like they were left behind, both because there's inadequate access to healthcare services, but also because the information about how to avoid contracting the virus was not readily available. We didn't have enough information to begin with when the virus started. And then with the shifting instructions and the politically motivated denial of whether this was a serious virus or not, really confused farm workers and made it very difficult to do outreach and to get them the supplies that they needed. I was shocked at how little of the PPE was available for the farm worker community, and started trying to raise resources to be able to get out to the field to make sure that they had masks and that they also had appropriate sanitation. Complaints were received that that they were working and there wasn't even water and soap to clean their hands. And so what we know is that it's certain that depression and all of the other mental health issues that come along with being a marginalized, forgotten community is going to be very, very high. The other part is that it's going to be really important that we have research that to help us decide what we need to do to change the public health response to COVID. One of the really frustrating things for me is, as you heard, I have 6 counties that are part of my district. And the way that we set up our emergency services is that the counties are our partners with the state. And so every county has the ability to have a different framework from which they work in order to protect their population when there's a virus or when there's a public health issue. What that means is it becomes very difficult to really figure out what's going on the ground, because the counties are doing everything a little bit differently. And when you have a population that, like farm workers, that travel to their work site and that may cross county lines, and invariably do, then you have to find out when they call for services, when they call my office and they say, here's what's happening and we don't have these PPE, or we don't know what's going on. We've got to figure out, where do you live and where do you work? And the instructions were different depending on the where they worked, which is not a good public health response to be able to do everything we can to protect farm workers. At the state level, it's almost like it's out of our hands. And yet we're the ones they turn to because they trust us and they know that we'll answer the questions and try to get them resources as quickly as possible. So one of the concerns I have is, how do we change our statewide public health response in order to protect the most vulnerable in our community, and to do it in a way that is systemic as opposed to based on what county you happen to be in. And particularly since in some of these counties, there were and still are deniers that this virus is serious and that you need to take precautions, that you need to wear a mask, that you need to socially distance. If you're getting mixed messages, it's very difficult to protect the most vulnerable. And I have to say, I have to give a big shout out to the UC Berkeley and the Clínica de Salud del Valle for their research project that they did, because although I had been talking to the governor's office about the lack of resources for farm workers in many of our counties, as I said, the counties prioritized where they were going to spend the money. And in many counties, the prioritization did not include farm workers. And so as I was pushing the governor's office to have a more robust response with research behind the numbers that we were seeing, it was incredibly important, because we were able to change some of the proposals that were coming out, some of the projects that were spending money for farm work. We were able to change them. And a real quick example is that the governor put together to his credit, he put together a program to be able to house farm workers that had become sick and needed to quarantine. And we knew that they were going home and to overcrowded housing situations, and that it's very difficult to quarantine and keep yourself away from your family if there's not enough room. And so there was a project that was put together called Housing for the Harvest. And the challenge with that is that it provided a place for a farm worker, if they're sick or if someone in their cuadrilla was sick, to go and quarantine away from their family. But if you live with a number of other families in a home, it's unlikely that, and what we heard and what the Clínica and UC Berkeley described is that farm workers didn't want to use that kind of housing. Number one, because if they felt if they were sick or they had to quarantine and they felt okay, they would prefer working because that's how they support their families. So you needed to provide wage replacement in order for people to feel comfortable quarantine, number one. And number two is you needed to provide an opportunity for them to take their family with them if they're going to be staying somewhere else, because otherwise they were abandoning their family in a household where they may not know all the different families that are living there. And so research, my point here is research is critically important when we're making decisions about how we're going to be developing programs that'll provide assistance and resources to the farm worker community, and we can't do it without research. So that's why this conference is so important, so that we can put some real practical information into the research, so that we're it's good data in, good data out is my point. So what I've learned going through this pandemic and being very frustrated at times with the lack of response for the farm worker community is that the more that we can articulate what the needs are and how we can respond, the better we're going to be able to create a framework, a policy framework that provides an opportunity for us in the future as we face either another pandemic or another emergency. We can do everything possible to make sure that in the farm worker community, the impact is no worse than that in any other community, number one, and hopefully better. And number two, that we can really build on the resiliency that you see in a community that is hardworking, that always shows up for work, and that needs really good information so that they can keep them and their family safe. So thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. Thank you for your patience in getting on and allowing me to get on. And I look forward to working with you in the future as we look at what do we need to do to keep farm workers safe, and what can we do to improve their overall health as well.
Thank you so much, Senator Caballero. Thank you for bearing with us as we figure out what the technical issue was. Don't you just love technology? We're glad that you all are here with us today. We have a packed conference agenda today with several panels, and our first panel will be underway in a minute. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Joel Derringer from our conference committee. Joel is moderating our first panel on community-based participatory research. So,
great. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. Glad to see how many people we have participating, as well as panelists. First, I want to thank Senator Caballero for all of her efforts and help in getting the funding with Assemblymember Rivas to get this whole thing going. And it was a lot of trips to Sacramento 2 years ago, but we're certainly seeing some payoff now. So I want to thank her not only for this funding, but the years and years and years of service on farm worker health issues. So I have the pleasure this morning of hosting our first panel on community-based participatory research. I'm lucky, I was very fortunate to have actually worked with all three of these researchers in the past year on the COVID-19 farm workers study, which was an exemplar of community-based participatory research. And it was grounded in community, and to hear the voice of farm workers and what was going on during COVID, and then translate that into some policy considerations. So not only are we dealing with this issue, but in future crises, which are inevitable, whether they're heat, drought, fire, wildfires, we know how to reach out and actually access the voice of the workers and make them forefront. So I'll introduce the three panelists first just let you know who they are, and then we'll move on from there without additional introductions. So first panelist is Tomas Madrigal, has a doctorate degree in Chicana and Chicano studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he studied US industrial agriculture, Mexican labor, and migration. He's a volunteer food systems researcher for community to community development and a volunteer union researchers for Familias Unidas por la Justicia and other organizations that support farm worker organizing throughout Washington state. Our next panelist will be Dr. Dvera Saxton, who's a medical and environmental anthropologist and associate professor in anthropology at Fresno State. Her recently released book, The Devil's Fruit, Farm Workers, Health and Environmental Justice, is available from Rutgers University Press. There is a offer to panelists, but I can't actually put it in the chat, providing for a discount on the book. And we'll try and figure that out. Bade, I've worked with for a long time, and it's really great to continue in those efforts. She's a professor of medical anthropology at California State University, San Marcos, where she's worked with indigenous and farm worker communities in California, the border region, and Oaxaca for more than 30 years. Her research focuses on the health and healthcare of farm workers, cultural interface in the clinical setting, access to and utilization of healthcare, the generation of alternatives to clinical medicine by indigenous communities, and Mixtec medicine and ethnobotany. So we have a great panel from all the way in Washington state, all the way down to the Mexican border. So I'll turn it over now to Tomas.
Good morning. Do you happen to have my PowerPoint, or should I share my screen?
Yep, you can go ahead and share your screen.
I'll go ahead and do that then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm. There it is. So as Joel mentioned, my name is Tomas Madrigal, and I am a food systems researcher for community development here in Washington. And I've been serving at different capacities with the organization since about 2006. And so I'm going to share with you today a bit of the work that we've been able to do. If I can figure out how to share this screen, there's a slideshow. Share screen.
So Tomas, while you're doing that, I'll just, so what we hope to do, each speaker will present for about 12 minutes, and then we really hope to have some, I'd like to say discussion, but that's not quite possible in the webinar format. But if you do have questions, please put them in the question and answer. So we will have time for questions and discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks. In this presentation, I intend to narrate the labor roots of the struggle for environmental justice that we see today. This lives in the unpublished history that lives in the oral histories of organizers, their archives, cultural workers, and researchers that continue to advance the fight for health and safety for agricultural workers. United Farm Workers Organizing Committee's entry into pesticides had to do with worker safety. From 1965 to 1971, United Farm Workers Organizing Committee led a sophisticated campaign against pesticides that was waged on several fronts, including the courts, boycotts, contracts, and legislature. The objective was unionization in order to provide better wages, security, and working conditions, as well as to ensure the health and safety of field workers through a union contract. In a recent conversation that I've had with Rosalinda Guillen here at Community about the Chateau St. Michel campaign here in Washington, she said, health and safety was one of the main reasons the workers organized, that and sexual harassment, but the pesticides were a big issue. Some of the workers were having low birth weights and frail babies. Protections from the pesticides was huge inside the contract. You could actually see the difference in the children of some of the families after that contract was imposed. On July 11th, 2013, over 200 farm workers observed the first of 7 work stoppages during the 2013 harvest season against their employer, Sycamore Brothers Farm in Burlington, Washington. Many of the demands that were presented to their employer had to do with health and safety, namely being allowed to take sick leave without a doctor's note, better living conditions, and childcare for their children. During this campaign, my role was to take the oral histories of many of the striking farm workers. One interview in particular, one with Juana Morelos Morales, was particularly memorable. At work, she experienced exposure to the pesticide as a drop laden with pesticides landed in her eyes and she left. She went home only to be sprayed by more pesticides in the labor camp as they were spraying the field adjacent to the labor camp. This led to her developing a blood infection, which she had to pay for out of her own pocket. These and many stories are the ones that are only available by direct communication with farm workers. At the beginning of May 2020 of this last year, a strike at Allenbro's fruit packing house over Seguridad y Salud sparked a series of rolling strikes at 7 different locations near Yakima, Washington. Many of the workers' demands had to do with employers not providing the minimum protections, personal protective equipment, and the failure to follow up on worker complaints. In the aftermath of the strikes, an agricultural worker union was formed called Trabajadores Unidas por la Justicia. Their first union contract campaign at Allenbro's Fruits, who had hired an anti-union consultants that interfered with the election, led to a national labor review board investigation that will happen this May. And we expect that that will be the first contract that Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia have. And of course, the contract that Familias Unidas por la Justicia were able to win also contains health and safety provisions within the contract. So in 1962, in California, the National Farmworkers Association was formed via house meetings and recruited more than 1,000 members. Dolores Huerta explained that the organization offered benefits. We had life insurance plan, we had an office, we started a credit union, the first farm worker credit union in the history of the United States, where people could get loans. We had a cooperative store, we did services, we did immigration work, we did their income taxes. We had a 5-year plan to have a national strike in the Central Valley because we wanted all of the growers to negotiate together. This, of course, history would do this with the outbreak of the Filipino strike in 1965, and the National Farm Worker Association merged with their organization to create the United Farm Workers. Going back to Washington, Tomas Villanueva had also supported the formation of a farm worker cooperative called the United Farm Workers Co-op in Washington, with no relation to the California efforts. He recalled in an interview that he had volunteered for the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee in 1966, and Cesar Chavez had assured him that nothing is going to change in the conditions of farm workers unless farm workers themselves do the changes. When they visited the gasoline co-ops that Chavez had established, In Washington, the United Farm Workers Co-op was formed with members investing $5 shares, and they started to run a sort of service defending people when growers did not pay their wages or when people got injured. We got people to get food stamps and those things, Tomas said. Rosalinda Guillen here at Community has consistently shared that it is not enough to address what is wrong. Farm workers have to advance their own solutions. And in 2002, she had attended the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil, where she encountered in real life a cooperative economy that was women-led and decisions were made collectively. And this thriving cooperative ecosystem was there in place. And she noted the happiness, the music, the color, the art, noting that all of these farm workers, all of these colors, we need this in the United States. And then upon her return from Porto Alegre, she formed community development. She said, our organization, it's not going to be a union. It is going to be about workers and labor, but we are going to have a different vision. When I go back and I read Cesar Chavez's speeches and what he thought, he also had this vision, self-determination, owning the means of production and owning land. And in 2014, Cooperativa Tierra y Libertad was born in Washington under this idea of ejidos. And so now 30 acres of this have been producing for the past 4 years and going into market to sustain the cooperative. And the remaining acreages will be split up into 5-acre plots for farm workers to do what they wish and also to live on them, like ejidos in Mexico. And so this hope, this vision is something that we've been able to conquer here in Washington. And going back to farm worker health, here in Washington in the late 1960s, the issue of health and safety for migrant agricultural workers had become critical. Martin Yanez, another person that I conducted an oral history with, shared that the local government had refunded the federal government's aid meant for farm worker health because the local health department could not identify migrant workers. Yanez became involved and made a meeting with 200 farm workers in Sunnyside, Washington, and the rest was history. Yanez and Tomas Villanueva joined together to create the Farm Workers Health Center. And beginning in 1973, after Tomas's support as the director, Yanez advanced as the director, and that clinic engaged and supported health education in the migrant community, using clinicians to support blood pressure checks and dental hygiene. 42 years later, health and safety has become the rallying cry for workers deemed essential through continuing working through the pandemic, yet they were disposable enough to risk premature death. On March 17th, C2C hosted an agricultural workers plenary, and farm workers from across Washington state shared how COVID-19 had exacerbated the poor working conditions that they had endured before the pandemic, and also shared how this forced them to come together to fight for health and safety. Rosalinda Guillen offered, this is not about apples. It is about our people. It's about farm workers. It's not about the berries. It really isn't about the pears and the berries. We're talking about human beings, people like myself, my father, my cousins, my brothers and sisters, people that I know right now, and that the indigenous farm workers and many other farm workers we have relationships with that are interested and are fighting for a better health food system. We asked people to comment on the rule process, the rules making process and labor industry started because we tried to work with the industry and the agricultural seasonal workers advisory committee to try to work together to implement temporary agency rules and guidance that would protect farm workers. But that did not work because there's really a bigger interest in making profit in agriculture at the risk of endangering farm workers from infection. Rosalinda Guillen left the United Farm Workers in 2003. She was a vice president. She said, "It's really unfortunate that the United Farm Workers could not see that vision because business unionism was already starting to appear." She elaborates that they had a farm worker lobby day and they would not let her meet with the farm workers. She didn't know what they were afraid of, but knew that without direct democracy, the efforts were going to fail. So she left and she formed community development with her severance pay. Similarly, Tomas Villanueva understood the approach that the United Farm Workers had begun to advance after the death of Cesar Chavez. He explained, "In my time as president here in Washington, there has been pretty much a confrontational kind of thing, which was good in those times. And we didn't have any type of backing. We didn't affiliate until after I left the union. And now we're talking about this collaborative approach of the Fair Trade Apple campaign. I feel sympathy for the agricultural growers, but my sympathies do not go so far as to say that farm workers should continue to subsidize the survival of the agricultural industry by cutting the wages and cutting their benefits. My sympathy cannot go that far." When it comes to farm workers in the United States,
Tomas, we're getting to the end of your time. We can just wind down. It was also a request from the interpreter to slow. I'm saying hurry up. She wants you to slow down.
I cannot see the chat, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So this hard-fought ground that I presented today is what is at stake. And it's the reason that we need to provincialize California. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And if people have questions, as I said, you can put them in the Q&A function and we'll get to them after our next two speakers. So next up is Dvera Saxton.
Okay, here we go. Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Tomas, and thanks to everyone else who had a part in making this convening possible, named and unnamed. My name is Dvera Saxton, and if you can't tell by my outfit, I'm an anthropologist. I'm a medical and environmental anthropologist, and I have the great privilege of working at Cal State Fresno, where I teach many of the children and grandchildren of farm workers and other agricultural workers. Earlier, before this panel started, I put a link in the chat to a coupon for my recently released book, The Devil's Fruit, Farm Workers' Health and Environmental Justice. And I thought it would be helpful today to use the different chapters in my book as an opportunity to explore ways that all of us from all the different disciplines can become solidarity scholars, to do research with farm workers and to do research as a form of care work. In the introductory chapter to my book, I spend a lot of time talking about where I come from as a researcher in terms of my intellectual training at American University, which has a very applied and activist focus to it. It isn't a traditional R1 university, but I really feel that the lessons I learned there from people who do scholar activism have really shaped what I do, but I also acknowledge that my own biography shapes what I do. I grew up in Pennsylvania And I'm not from a farm worker family, but I grew up around farm workers. Southeastern Pennsylvania is the mushroom capital of the world. They used to claim, I don't know if that's true anymore. But I went to school with the children of farm workers and developed curiosities and concerns from my interactions with students, trading homework and doing what young people do, but also in a very unconventional way. And my father, as a member of the Friends, Quaker communities in the 1960s and 70s, was really active in developing low-cost housing and a childcare center in our community, the TikTok Center for Early Learning, which still stands today over 50 years later, that served a lot of children of farm workers. So a lot of you, including the Chancellor and Senator Caballero and Dr. Padilla, have also acknowledged your positionalities, how where you come from shapes what you do. And while I'm not, again, not a farm worker, I used those experiences to build relationships with farm workers and with the organizations that serve them. While this panel has been titled Community-Based Participatory Research, I'm not sure that's the best term for what I do or what the rest of us do. It's a community-based participatory research is a very specific model. But that being said, fostering sincere, caring, and trusting relationships with communities is imperative for any kind of farm worker research or any other research where you're interested in not just collecting data from farm workers, but mobilizing that data to support their own life goals. And so I think the three talks today represent necessary paradigm shifts in the area of farm worker research, regardless of what discipline you're coming from. And ultimately, we're here how to learn how our work from all the different disciplines can support farm worker health. My positionality, though, too, is to be very intentional and explicit about being an activist scholar. When I was doing my research with farm workers in the Pajaro and Salinas valleys on California's Central Coast between 2010 and 2013, I learned from farm workers, from my conversations from them, that health is not one thing, it is many things. It is multidimensional and eco-social, to borrow from epidemiologist Nancy Krieger. And that means that all the different variables that affect farm worker health are like a tree, with branches and twigs and vines and roots going in all different directions. The linear models of cause and effect of isolating variables in my ethnographic research didn't make sense and didn't align with the narratives of farm workers and their families that they shared with me during my time on the coast and into the present moment in my work with my Fresno State students who are also reading my book this semester and wrote me reading responses that it really resonated with them. And so I see that as another part of any kind of community-based or solidarity research, that there is a process of vetting and back and forth where you present results to the communities you've done research with so that they can validate or not what you say you found. So just like I'm presenting an argument in the book against a linear paradigm and letting farm worker stories speak for themselves, and that includes juxtaposing myths about farm workers, sometimes myths that research can tell too, depending on how it's framed. So I've titled this talk Solidarity, Scholarly Solidarities to help bridge the different people here today who come from these different research traditions and different institutions. This activist methodology of myth busting led me to think about how what farm workers told me juxtaposed to some of the assumptions in our wider society, but also assumptions that come from research. And some things for us to think about: do the laws on the books or the policies that we make really work if we don't have enforcement? What are the strengths and often underestimated limits of policy change, especially when it comes to the ubiquity of labor and environmental abuses in farm work? Would transitioning to organic really address all of the other concerns that farm workers have? Does it change the labor paradigms? And there's people here who have done that kind of work, Dr. Strolik, for example. How do these and other myths about immigrant farm workers affect their lives, work, and health? Have we really made progress since the time of the UFW movement, or in some ways have we regressed? What are the consequences of our own assumptions about farm workers and their health or their culture, their behaviors? How does this affect research? How does it shape the questions we pose and the conclusions we draw? And ultimately, how does that feed into the kinds of social and systems change that we seek? Are farm workers hard to reach, or are we and our institutions out of touch? And how can building, and what will it take to build the kinds of relationships with farm workers to accomplish their, to work with them to help them accomplish their life and health goals? Another methodological approach I used as a activist anthropologist was to follow the strawberries. And how did I, from the East Coast, end up in a place like Watsonville, California, Salinas and Pajaro Valleys? Was that I literally followed a box of Driscoll strawberries from the Whole Foods at the that was near my graduate school in Washington, DC, which said Watsonville on it, to Watsonville, and develop relationships with the Center for Farm Worker Families, which is based in Santa Cruz and Monterey counties, with Dr. Ann Lopez, and eventually to the Watsonville Brown Berets, many of whom were the children and grandchildren of farm workers. And when I came to their meetings, I told them what I was interested in. I was there to study the syndemics of farm worker health, looking at how different health disparities layered in the bodies of farm workers. And they asked me, well, can you help us with this campaign against methyl iodide, which was at the time a soil fumigant pesticide that was being considered for use in the strawberry fields and other agricultural fields. It was very concerning because it was super toxic in all of the ways, affecting almost all of the bodily systems. And it was about to be kind of passed through to replace another very toxic, dangerous soil fumigant, methyl bromide. So even though I didn't anticipate it, it wasn't part of my protocol. It wasn't part of the grant proposals I had submitted. I ended up following the strawberries, but also following the leads of farm workers and their children and grandchildren and their public school teachers with respect to what was important to them. And that's led me to continue to ask those questions with them about the health effects of chronic ubiquitous pesticide exposure throughout the life course. And there are people here who are involved in that kind of work too. The newspaper article on the right was written by a former student of mine. And so the collaborations that I've fostered too are not just with our interesting at a place like Fresno State, where I develop mentoring relationships with students, but also they mentor me and tell me what's significant in their lives, which informs my research practice. So following strawberries also became about trusting the instincts and leads of farm workers as well, which is something we can all learn from. Through that, I also met Gerardo and his brother Luz. They had migrated to California from Jalisco in the 1970s following the death of their father, who had recently transitioned to Green Revolution style corn agriculture in his 50s. And so their father's death propelled their migration to the United States as a set of siblings. Gerardo experienced his own pesticide exposures pulling hose in the strawberries, which is an older way of applying pesticides, kind of represented in the photo below. And he narrated to me, his brother asked me to talk to him so that he could share this illness narrative of in the early 1980s being physically paralyzed by the exposure and unable to go to work, fired from his job. He recovered partially, but his condition continued to deteriorate and exacerbate, which led him to go back and forth between the US and Mexico, seeking alternative remedies, sometimes relying on alcohol to assuage the trauma and stress of having very strange and scary neurological symptoms. But eventually, when he qualified for Medicaid in his 60s, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And so seeing through farm workers' narratives how these different toxic layers are invisibilized. They're not invisible. They're not invisible to farm workers. They're invisibilized to outsiders because we're asked, we aren't listening. Sometimes we don't listen. We're not, unless you're in solidarity and working alongside farm workers, you're not going to hear these stories. So thinking about how these things layer in their lives is another methodological strategy that aligns with the syndemics framework, again, thinking about how diseases and disparities layer and exacerbate one another. And Gerardo's case is a really clear case of that, but also a binational case of that.
Dvera, if we can wind down, that would be great.
Sure. So I'll close with some thoughts on accompaniment as research strategy in terms of building relationships and ways that we may accompany farm workers through our work, through our training of students. We urgently need to train more healthcare providers and emergency responders in toxicology and occupational hazards, laws, and reporting. We need to develop, as Tomas alluded to, and to support non-toxic alternatives, and non-toxic meaning without toxic pesticides, but also without toxic labor relations that give workers more control and power over their own lives and occupations. Farm workers themselves have a lot of knowledge and expertise on this. We should grant farm workers the same rights and protections as other workers, including access to healthcare coverage. Farm workers need immediate amnesty and relief for their families beyond the current proposed reforms. We need to do more than shop our way to personal health and safety. We can't always rely on state and county data because sometimes it isn't collected. So what can we as researchers do to find ways to collect the data that's necessary? But we also shouldn't expect farm workers to wait until we're done collecting all this data on how all of the different layers in their lives are hurting them. We should also put more stock in their own narratives as experts in their own lives to guide us in that. We should trust them too. So thank you all, and I hope you'll buy the book. And if you have any questions about the book or any of the things I've presented today, here I am. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dvera. And, you know, we have 3 anthropologists on this panel, but I like to call Bonnie sort of the dean of medical anthropologists with farm workers, but maybe that's just because I've known her the longest. You're on.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here. Thanks to Paul Brown, Joel Dieringer, and the UC Merced team for providing this chance to present. Today, I'd like to share with you something about which I am very passionate, which are collaborative research methods, particularly those appropriate for working with farm worker communities. I've published this work in a research methods handbook called Migration in Health by the University of California Press. Collaborative research methods are long-term and reciprocal, and involve partnership and empowerment, and the partnership is centered on student and community researchers. Fundamental to an appropriate collaborative research method is that the research is determined collaboratively, with the needs and priorities of the community directing the goals of researchers, while training new student and community researchers in methods that are mindful, relevant, ethical, and sustainable. I will use examples from the anthropology program I founded at CSU San Marcos to provide a how-to on changing the purpose and intent of research, particularly for those researchers who work with migrant, indigenous, and underserved communities. Here, you can see Don Erasto Camasena instructing students on medicinal plants. Okay, so first let's talk about horizontal research. Horizontal research is a response to verticality. Verticality is research in which the researcher studies down by studying various characteristics of a specific community, migrants, farm workers, urban poor, underserved, but then writes up in order to professionally validate these findings in peer-reviewed, theoretically focused journals that are not accessible to the communities upon whom they focus, but instead are geared to a specialized audience of academic researchers. Verticality manifests as research projects that are determined to be relevant by the researcher and the researcher's disciplinary orientation without consultation with or inclusion of the community being studied. In contrast, collaborative research methodology transforms informants or subjects into participating collaborators by including them in the research design, research project implementation and execution, analysis of data and information, production of findings, and presentation of work. Through inclusion, research using collaborative methodology ensures the relevance of the research to the community under investigation. In this sense, the objective of collaborative research is to promote complementary exchange of resources to examine global phenomenon happening locally, and to generate on-the-ground cultural, social, political, and economic tools to address issues of health and community well-being. A key component of collaborative research is the analytical tool of self-reflection. Self-reflection furthers social science research through change towards mindful practice. Most importantly, self-reflection research involves changing the ways that we conceptualize research design and changing the ways that we train new researchers. Collaborative research emerges at a 21st century expression of the need for change. The appropriate model for collaborative social science research unites the education of all new researchers with the purpose of qualitative and quantitative research and the needs of the local community. So let's consider those needs. Collaborative research involves partnerships between researchers, institutions, and agencies, and communities and CBOs who are united through long-term collaborative research projects to address regional needs. A pragmatic approach recognizes the needs and priorities of the parties engaged in collaborative research projects. The researcher working at a university, health agency, or other institution has specific needs that must be met when conducting research. These needs revolve around the researcher's academic and professional career and include performance expectations from the academic discipline, agency, or university institution. The needs of the community collaborators can be addressed through engagement with the researchers, needs such as those that you see here: cultural revitalization and promotion, political and economic recognition, health and healthcare goals, community well-being, and rights. At the same time, the university or the institution has needs such as the education of students, the promotion of image through community engagement and employee achievements, name recognition, positive press, marketability funding sources, and so on, which are met through collaborative research projects that focus on regional communities. The needs of all, the researcher, university agency, and the community, are united by the students or community workers conducting the research, who gain meaningful learning experiences and become empowered with valuable research skills, such as interviewing and conducting surveys. CSUSM's anthropology curriculum serves as a model for collaborative energy. With classes like medical ethnography, students work with Donerasto Camasena and the Binational Indigenous Organizations Front to build a community garden and to document plant knowledge. Under FIOB and Donerasto's direction, we created a printable Mixtec ethnobotany database. So, in the process of instruction of new researchers, we pool the resources, land, labor, knowledge, to generate cultural capital. Taking a closer look at resources, in collaborative research, we identify and integrate resources from the collaboration. Each participating entity brings to the table valuable and useful resources that are applicable to the research design, execution, analysis, write-up, and distribution of findings. The researcher brings qualitative and quantitative research training, acts as teacher trainer to students and other participants, and serves as a liaison between the community and local health and social service agencies. The community research partner brings the resources of the community, including knowledge bearers, cultural and political leaders, and cultural knowledge involving everything from health to history to organizational models. The institution, such as a university or a healthcare agency, brings technological and monetary resource and access to a workforce, such as students, to contribute to the accomplishment of the research. The students are central, linking the other three partners in the research project through both labor and because they are from the community. At Cal State San Marcos, for example, we are more than 40% Latino students. In collaborative research projects, like the documentation of Mixtec plant knowledge, many of the students themselves are Mixtec, so they're engaged in indigenous anthropology, studying aspects of their own community in the context of a collaborative research project. The students are participating in the generation of cultural capital and contributing to the shape that cultural capital takes and how it is used. So, collaborative research is ethical. The collaborative research method consciously seeks to cultivate an approach to research that places the researcher's goals in line with the interests and needs of the community collaborators. This is particularly important when working with farm worker, indigenous, and migrant communities. Field research in migrant and local communities takes time, and even when participants are compensated, becomes tiresome to the community if it is not linked to tangible outcomes of some kind that are accessible and useful to the community. Researchers who work without cultivated collaborative links to the community about whom they investigate expend valuable social capital and can negatively impact future research about crucial issues ranging from vaccinations to wildfire and work experiences. Regional and transnational migrant communities in the US are technologically and culturally sophisticated, engaging to promote their own interests and needs via acquisition of nonprofit status, celebration of culture and history, advocacy for social, economic, and cultural justice, and savvy use of social media. Contemporary researchers must recognize the value of Indigenous and community perspective, incorporate relevant and tangible components in their research projects, and generate studies that invite collaboration and community contribution at all levels. Collaborative methodology is mindful of the historic role of researchers in the lives of Indigenous and other communities, and that much research knowledge generation has occurred in the context of a continued colonial mentality in which the researcher extracts resources like cultural knowledge and demographic data from the community in the form of qualitative and quantitative data. Without the cultivation of collaborative links with the community, researchers can damage the prospects of future research with a community like farm workers when their research projects involve a helicopter approach that dips into the community for resources like information, extracts those resources, and then disappears from the community view as results are published in journals and periodicals that do not advocate change or produce tangible effects from the perspective of the studied community. Purposeful collaboration deconstructs the unequal power dynamic in which research and the production of research knowledge takes place. Purposeful collaboration provides multiple perspectives on research aims, data interpretation, and the morphology of research outcomes. Purposeful collaboration ensures more accurate data. So again, collaborative methodology transforms the researcher self and the community other into the collective researching we. Collaborative research is sustainable by envisioning research projects as integral to the community in which they take place, and by addressing the needs of the collaborating partners. The collaborative research method makes research sustainable, and unlike one-time funded grant-dependent research projects that we all know cost a ton, the collaborative research method can generate long-term longitudinal research with migrant, immigrant, and farm worker communities, and can produce data that has the power to invoke action through policy change and other means. Research collaborations with farm workers, migrant and immigrant communities, health communities, and indigenous communities tend to focus on leveraging resources and raising awareness to address such issues as human rights, health, and community well-being. By working closely with locally based communities like CBOs, collaborative research addresses regional needs, thus enhancing the position of the university or agency in terms of its significance to the surrounding community that lives in the region, works there, and sends students to it for education. For example, in this class, Anthropology 440, Farm Worker Health Ethnography, students conduct original research with farm workers in collaboration with Vista Community Clinic and local CBOs like the Coalition of Indigenous Oaxacan Communities to produce a report relevant to both parties and relevant to place. To the region of San Diego County that has a nearly $2 billion a year agricultural industry and thousands of farm workers who use local migrant clinics like VCC and whose kids end up at the university. No matter where the place, local communities, agencies, and CBOs exist and work to improve the lives of migrant and immigrant communities, and they share common goals with researchers and communities. I think I may have,
Bonnie, I'm getting a little cue to wind down.
I think I may have made my point. Thank you. Collaborative research methods bridge the community with institutions and agencies that service them and provide voice to underrepresented groups in academic, health, provider, social service, education, governmental, and legal agencies. Collaborative research methods are guided by the needs of the community and purposely incorporate the resources and voice of all participating collaborators. The products of collaborative research can reach beyond academic publications to impact policy, advocacy, and services related to farm worker and immigrant communities. I thank you all for your time, and I hope that this has been a useful presentation for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bonnie, Dvera, and Tomas. We have a few minutes for questions, and I want to again suggest people put them in the Q&A. I also want to say, if your comments, for those of you who are participants or attendees, somehow it ended up that everyone has Melissa's name. So there's some comments coming through, but I've never known Melissa to have that many comments. So if you can please change your name, then we can at least understand from whom it's coming. So one question I had early on in the Q&A was for Tomas, and it was really wanting to talk a little bit more about the provinciality and globalism, and particularly in California. So maybe if you want to take a minute or two, I know you answered it in a chat to the panelists, but if you want to take a moment to explain a little bit more about what you were thinking about.
Yeah, I think the warning came at the turn of the 20th century with Walter Goldschmidt. He warned that as California goes, so goes the nation. And I think that in the 21st century, we're beyond that. California is now a province of a global economy. And the things that are beneficial to one region may be negative to one region. So, for example, the Farm Worker Modernization Act is negatively impactful to our organizing efforts in Washington State. It's an anti-union bill for us in many, many ways, and as well as other of our allies in other parts of the United States. And so we do not see it as an immigration bill, and we're vehemently against it. But we understand that it might be beneficial to the specific context of the United Farm Workers in California that exist within the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act, which was passed in 1975 and had a negative impact in that historical trajectory that I was drawing. Actually, that marks the movement of that specific organization into a business unionism that is fine if that's what you want to do, but we actually want farm workers to lead and to have democratic power in their groups, and the organizations that we're supporting to develop globally, right? So SINJA, the Sindicato Independiente Nacional de Jornaleros Agrícolas, Familias Unidas por la Justicia, and now Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia, and many of our the unions that we've supported to develop in New York, even in Canada, in different areas, are independent and democratic unions. And so these need to be able to coexist. And part of that, I think, is the necessary move to provincialize California, and that not everything that's beneficial to California is beneficial to the rest of the nation.
Thank you, Tomas, for speaking a little bit more on that. There's one question. So Bonnie noted, congratulations on your great work. And it would be wonderful to see your ethnobotany study. Is that possible?
Right now, the ethnobotany database is in the hands of the Binational Indigenous Organization Front, so I can't release it publicly. However, we're in the process of trying to put that all together. We have constructed a lot of books. One of my projects for my students is to publish a book through blurb.com or one of those. And so we take that information and construct books, again, following the collaborative methodology of producing a tangible product of research that's useful to the community. So all of those books have been gifted to not only Donerasto Kamasena, but also to the Binational Indigenous Organizations Front. But it's a beautiful garden. It's about 1.7 acres. And every semester I teach courses out there with community educators from Mixtec, Zapotec, Luiseño, Kumeyaay, and other local indigenous communities.
Great, thank you. And there's another question for you. You do a great job of persuasively laying out the case for collaborative methodologies. And I wonder how you handle resistance from other scholars. How do the rest of us make the case for this type of work in the face of resistance?
Oh, well, one way to do it is to go back to the students. I mean, we are all involved in training researchers in one way or another. And my intent is to get researchers trained in an appropriate way that honors the community and actually allows the community to lead. And so if you're interested in a step-by-step how-to on how to do that, you can find that in the actual paper that's published, the article that's published in that book by Mark Schenker and others, research methodologies in immigrant communities or something like that. I posted it. I forget the name of the book, the exact name, but it's a hard sell sometimes. And as an anthropologist, I work with archaeologists, and I also advocate the same thing, that indigenous people should be leading archaeological research. And I get a lot of resistance there too. And usually the resistance from everyone centers around the resistance to accepting the fact that indigenous, migrant, and farm worker communities have the ability and the capacity to take their own destinies into their hands and to lead researchers into what is important to them. And so that would be the way I would suggest to do it. If you have a research project you want to do, go talk to the community first and say, look, I have these students, or I have this research project. What do you want? And what kind of products are important? Because again, you know, publishing in peer-reviewed Journals and periodicals is all very good for the individual researcher, but it really does nothing for the community. And so we're looking to change that and create tangible products that work on the for the behalf of the community.
Great, thank you. And it's a wonderful comment to wind up the session. Want to thank all of our panelists, and we'll move on. We're on time at the end of the first session. See, Crystal's smiling. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you everyone for presenting. So we're going to have 2 panels concurrently going. So we'll have one here in webinar 1, which will be moderated by Dr. Flores, and then in webinar 2, which will be moderated by Dr. Brown. In the chat, Melissa will be putting in the link. She just put in the link. So if you are a panelist in the webinar number 2, please use your link as a panelist, and everyone else can use the link that is posted there. And we will be moving over shortly. So if you want to move over, and we will get started just here in a couple minutes. Let's wait till 11:30 to make sure everyone is able to get on. Thank you.